I remembered the smell before I remembered the sky. The air on Gathris was thick with burned incense, burned flesh, and the metallic sting of industry, all braided together into something the locals called devotion and the rest of us called suffocation. I had been deployed to fanatical worlds before, but none prepared me for the way Gathris seemed to pray with every breath it exhaled. Even the wind carried chants, drifting from hive spires shaped like towering reliquaries, each carved with thousands of faces twisted in worship. I arrived as Sergeant Caden Marr, 17th year in the Imperial Infantry, veteran of too many purges to count, but on Gathris I felt like a novice. The planet did not simply believe in the Imperium. It demanded belief as a form of blood payment. Our regiment had been sent to extract a list of heretical agitators hiding in the deeper manufactorum levels, but the truth whispered among the officers was simpler and more disturbing. High Command did not trust Gathris anymore. A world that worshipped the Imperium with such ferocity could tilt into madness at any moment, and madness was more dangerous than treason. When my boots first touched the ash-coated landing platform, I felt eyes on me. Not the usual stares of civilians watching soldiers march. These were hungry gazes, searching my armor for flaws, looking for signs of insufficient purity. I kept my helmet sealed, because showing my face on Gathris felt like submitting it to judgment. The clergy greeted us with a procession of chanting priests brandishing relics so worn they were almost unrecognizable. They bowed so low their foreheads touched the ground, yet their eyes darted up constantly, as if making sure we noticed how deeply they worshipped. Their robes were stitched with dried blood, some of it fresh enough to glisten. I tried not to stare at the stains, but they were impossible to ignore. One of them, a tall cleric with a mask shaped like a screaming saint, pulled me aside and pressed a purity seal onto my breastplate. He whispered that the seal would protect me from the unworthy thoughts lurking in the lower hives. I murmured a standard blessing in response, but he watched my lips with unsettling intensity, making sure I recited each word correctly. I realized then that on Gathris, even a breath out of cadence was an offense. We marched through Hivacella, and every face we passed looked both terrified and ecstatic. Children carried censers heavier than their arms. Workers knelt in oily gutters, chanting until their voices cracked. Some pressed their hands into open wounds as offerings, convinced pain was the only honest worship. I saw a woman holding a dying man in her arms, not to comfort him, but to angle his face toward a shrine so he could die with proper devotion. My squad remained silent. We had learned long ago that on planets like this, any comment spoken aloud could mark you as an outsider, and outsiders burned quickly here. The shrines we passed were lit by flickering tubes that hummed like trapped insects, casting everything in sickly yellow light that made the shadows cling to us like damp cloth. By the time we reached our assigned barracks, my nerves were already fraying. The walls were carved with warnings, every surface saturated with scripture. Sleep bunks were pressed between stone panels etched with commandments, each line stained by the sweat of generations who slept under the weight of constant judgment. I removed my helmet, expecting a moment of relief, but the air inside the barracks was somehow thicker than outside. My squad looked just as uneasy. Corporal Rollick ran a hand across one of the carved lines and immediately wiped it clean on his sleeve, as if touching the words left residue. He muttered that he felt watched, and I did not correct him. He was right. The entire planet watched. That first night, the chants never stopped. They filtered through the vents like a continuous heartbeat, rising and falling with unnatural rhythm. I lay in my bunk, hands folded on my chest, listening to the prayers thrum through the metal floor. They were not soothing. They were desperate, relentless, as if the planet believed that stopping for even a moment would invite damnation. I tried to sleep, but each time I drifted close, a sudden wail of exultation jolted me awake. My thoughts twisted in the dark. I wondered if the people here worshipped the Emperor or worshipped their own fear. Either way, the devotion had grown into something monstrous. When dawn came, the sky burned red from the smoke of countless sacrificial pyres. My squad assembled for our descent into the manufactorum levels where the suspected heretics were hiding. As we prepared, a priest approached us carrying a reliquary shaped like a severed hand. He insisted each of us touch it. Rollick hesitated, and the priest's expression darkened in a way I will never forget. I ordered Rollick to comply, and he did, but afterward he walked slightly behind us, shoulders hunched, as if fearing eyes boring into his spine. The reliquary's surface had felt unnaturally warm against my glove, as though the hand within still pulsed with faith or something pretending to be faith. We moved through industrial corridors dripping with condensation, the machinery groaning like beasts chained in the dark. Pipes rattled beneath our feet, carrying vapor that reeked of sacred oils and rusted metal. Every corner was marked with devotional symbols, but some had been smeared or defaced, and those marks chilled me. On a world this devoted, defacement was not rebellion. It was suicide. Our Auspex scanners flickered with interference, scrambled by the sheer density of chanting echoing through the hive's structural supports. It felt like the planet itself was trying to drown out any voice that did not speak worship. As we pushed deeper, the temperature rose. Sweat collected under my armor, and my breathing grew tighter. My palms itched against the grips of my rifle. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, flickering with the distant glow of malfunctioning lights. I began to sense movement ahead, not footsteps or machinery, but the faint ripple of bodies shifting in the dark. My squad tightened formation, rifles raised, but no enemy emerged. Instead, we found an abandoned chapel carved into the industrial stone, filled with candles that had long melted into puddles. The altar bore the sigil of the Imperium, but someone had etched new lines into it, twisting the symbol into a distorted parody. Rollick whispered a curse, and I shushed him, but fear crawled down the back of my neck. Something was wrong in this chapel. It felt alive, watching, judging. As we stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath us, and a low moan rolled through the air. It was not mechanical. It was human, distant yet near, as if the walls themselves remembered suffering. I raised my rifle, scanning every corner, but nothing moved. Then I noticed the faint smell of fresh blood beneath the incense. The kind that meant someone had been here recently. The kind that meant we were not the only ones hunting. That was when I began to understand a terrible truth. On Gathris, fanaticism was not a belief. It was a predator, and we had just stepped into its feeding ground. The air in the abandoned chapel felt too warm, as though the walls themselves exhaled. I stepped forward, boots scraping across the stone floor, and every sound seemed amplified in the suffocating silence. My squad formed a tight semicircle behind me, rifles raised, breaths shallow. The candles had melted into unrecognizable shapes, forming wax stalagmites around the altar, as if the planet had tried to grow its own grotesque congregation. I felt the weight of my helmet pressing against my skull, almost protective, yet not enough. The twisted sigil on the altar demanded attention, lines carved with desperate force, as though whoever made them had cut deeper than intended. I ran a gloved finger over one groove and felt a tremor travel up my arm, an irrational sensation that something in the carving wanted to be remembered. Rollick approached my side, his face pale beneath his visor, his steps hesitant. He whispered that he heard something under the chanting, a second voice layered beneath the constant hum of devotion permeating the hive. I pressed my ear to the cold wall and strained to listen, and at first I heard only the familiar droning prayers carried by ventilation shafts. But then, faint and broken, I detected a deeper rumble, almost a vibration more than a sound, like a whispered argument between buried spirits. It unsettled me in a way the visible fanaticism had not. The surface worship here was already unbearable, but this hidden tone felt like the planet itself was chanting through its own wounds. I ordered the squad to sweep the chapel, hoping that action would ground us again, but none of us could shake the feeling that we were trespassing on something that had not wanted witnesses. As we searched, the lights flickered overhead, casting the room into alternating states of blindness and clarity. In the momentary blackness, I sensed the outlines of figures standing behind us, only for the glow to return and reveal empty space. It happened repeatedly, each flicker presenting a different haunting shape that vanished before I could raise my rifle. Rollick cursed under his breath, and Private Tessa tightened her grip on her weapon until her knuckles whitened. The chapel's air thickened, humidity clinging to the inside of my armor, making breathing laborious. I tried to steady myself by reciting fragments of doctrine, but the words tasted wrong in my mouth, as though the air twisted them before I spoke. A sudden clang echoed from the far corridor, and we all turned sharply, rifles trained, tense enough that a dropped pin would have sparked gunfire. I led the squad toward the source of the sound, moving with practiced precision, each step deliberate. The corridor narrowed as we progressed, the walls closing in like the throat of some dormant creature. The devotional symbols here had been scratched away with frantic strokes, leaving gouges in the metal that reminded me of claw marks. The deeper we went, the louder the second chant became, no longer just a rumble but a rhythmic pulse that made the ground subtly vibrate. My heart beat in unwanted sync with the sound, and I despised the sensation. Tessa's voice trembled as she asked if this was the heretic hideout, but I could not answer. This felt older than rebellion and far more personal than treason. Fanatic worlds rarely moved in organized shadows. They fractured inward, devouring themselves long before enemies arrived. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, a manufacturum assembly hall repurposed into a ritual space. Hundreds of chains hung from the ceiling, clinking softly as they swayed, each one bearing a rusted hook or a dangling charm carved with scripture. The floor was stained from years of spilled oil and blood mixed into one indistinguishable pattern, shaped by countless feet kneeling in synchronized fervor. A massive shrine occupied the center, a fusion of machine parts and bone fragments wired together into a towering effigy. Its hollow eye sockets glowed faintly, though no light source was visible. My squad hesitated, unwilling to step closer, and a rare uncertainty gripped my chest. The place radiated devotion twisted into madness, the kind of worship that broke minds long before it broke bodies. I forced myself forward, unwilling to show fear when my squad watched every movement I made. Beneath the shrine, half hidden by shadows, we found the remains of several individuals arranged in deliberate positions. Their bodies were gaunt, almost skeletal, their faces frozen in expressions of blissful agony. They had not been killed by any weapon I recognized. Their veins were darkened beneath the skin, branching in patterns that mirrored the twisted symbol we had seen in the chapel upstairs. Rollick gagged and turned away, while Tessa knelt to examine one of the corpses, tracing the darkened veins with the tip of her gauntlet. She said it looked like they had died praying. The idea made my stomach tighten. The corpse's hands were blistered, as if burned by something they held during their final moments. I pried open the nearest stiffened fingers and discovered a fragment of a devotional charm etched with lines that did not match sanctioned scripture. As I studied it, the faint, deeper chant grew louder, like a breath pressed against the back of my neck. I instructed the squad to form a perimeter while I scanned the room again, but something felt wrong with our formation. It took me several seconds to realize that Tessa was no longer at her assigned position. I called her name through the vox, hearing static in response. Rollick shouted that he saw movement near the far corner, and we converged on the spot, weapons raised, hearts hammering. The chains above us clattered violently as if reacting to our presence. A figure stepped from the shadows, and for a moment dread flooded my nerves. Then relief followed when I recognized Tessa's armor silhouette, though relief soured quickly. She moved strangely, her posture rigid, her motions too precise, as though each step followed a pattern not of her choosing. Her visor tilted toward us, and her voice crackled through the vox, layered with something that did not belong to her. She whispered that the people here were not hiding heresy. They were obeying a command whispered beneath the planet's prayers. She said it had always been calling to them, guiding them, feeding on their devotion until it demanded more. I ordered her to stand down and remove her helmet, hoping to break whatever influence held her. Instead, she stepped back, her hand drifting toward her rifle in a slow, deliberate motion. Rollick aimed his weapon, voice shaking as he told her to stop. The air tightened, the deeper chant vibrating through my armor as though urging us toward violence. I tried to reason with her, reaching out, hoping to find some shred of the soldier I knew. She flinched at my touch, then jerked violently, as if something inside her recoiled. Her helmet's vox emitted a low wail that grew into a distorted scream. The chains rattled overhead, and the shrine's hollow eyes glimmered brighter. Tessa stumbled backward, gripping her head, and collapsed to her knees. Her scream cut off abruptly as she slumped forward, motionless. Rollick rushed to her side, rolling her over with trembling hands. When her visor tilted upward, I saw her eyes through the shattered lens, glazed and unfocused. She was not dead, but she was lost, trapped in whatever madness had rooted itself within her mind. I felt a surge of helpless fury, the kind I had not experienced since my earliest battles before I learned to bury emotion beneath discipline. The deeper chant pulsed again, stronger, as if savoring her collapse. We carried her out of the chamber, retreating down the corridor with renewed urgency. The shadows seemed to move with us, the flickering lights tracking our retreat like watchful eyes. The moment we re-entered the chapel, the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, though not enough to calm the storm inside me. Tessa remained unconscious, strapped to a stretcher, her breathing shallow and irregular. Rollick muttered that we should call for extraction, but I knew command would not approve without confirmation of a threat. And what threat could we describe? A chanting planet, a twisted shrine, and a soldier whose mind cracked under its influence. None of it would survive bureaucratic scrutiny. I clenched my jaw as I realized the truth I had dreaded since arrival. On Gathris, fanaticism was not only expected, it was enforced, and whatever enforced it had just reached out to claim one of my own. We hauled Tessa back through the hive corridors, her limp form strapped to the stretcher, her breaths shallow and unsettlingly rhythmic. Each exhale aligned with the distant chant rising from the planet's depths. It made my skin crawl. Rollick walked beside her, a hand on her shoulder as if his touch alone could anchor her to sanity. I kept my rifle raised while leading the way, scanning every shifting shadow for the shape of a fanatic or something worse. The manufactorum vents spat steam in uneven bursts, each one a hiss like whispered prayer. Even the pipes seemed to vibrate from the endless chanting, as though the hive structures themselves were singing their devotion into the bones of anyone who walked near them. As we approached the lift shaft, the lights flickered again, but this time the darkness lasted longer. In that extended moment of blindness, I felt a cold brush along my wrist, like fingers trying to test my pulse. I swung my weapon up instinctively, but the lights snapped back on, revealing nothing but empty passageway. My squad shifted uneasily, exchanging glances of silent dread. Rollick asked whether I felt it too, and I nodded without hesitation. There was no point denying the presence that seemed to cling to us. It was not a person or a creature. It was a pressure, a sentience woven into the air and stone. Something on Gathris listened to our footsteps the way predators listened for wounded prey. When the lift finally arrived, its doors groaned open as if reluctant to let us escape the depths. We stepped inside, Tessa's stretcher sliding in with a dull scrape. The lift descended through the hive's layers, passing floors filled with muffled chanting. Some levels were silent, but the silence felt worse, as though the inhabitants held their breath until we passed. When we reached the upper levels reserved for military personnel, I expected relief. Instead, I was greeted with more eyes. Soldiers, clerks, priests, servitors. Every one of them stared as we carried Tessa through the corridors. Their gazes were intense, almost accusatory, as if they sensed we had seen something forbidden. A priest stepped forward, trying to touch Tessa's forehead with a metal-branded finger, but I shoved him away with a glare that made my intentions clear. He backed off immediately, mumbling something about purifying the tainted. Inside the barracks, I ordered Rollick to secure the entrance while I examined Tessa. Her eyes fluttered beneath closed lids, her fingers twitching in patterns that did not match any reflex I recognized. It was as if she were tracing symbols in the air, symbols only she could see. Sweat pooled beneath her armor seals, and her lips moved without sound. I leaned closer and heard faint whispers coming from her helmet's cracked vox unit. Not her voice, a layered murmur, like dozens of voices speaking in unison. I pulled the helmet off carefully, revealing her face contorted with a mixture of fear and devotion. I wanted to shake her awake, force her back from whatever abyss she hovered above, but I knew it would do nothing. Fanatic worlds did not just preach, they consumed. Rallick insisted that we contact Command, but I hesitated. Command would dismiss this as a psychological collapse or disciplinary issue, and any suggestion of something more sinister would be buried under doctrine and bureaucracy. Gathris was too valuable a shrine world for rumors of corruption to spread. My stomach churned as I realized we were isolated not just physically but politically. The truth on this planet was not meant to be spoken. I ordered the squad to rest, though none of us could. The barracks felt suffocating, the carved scripture watching us with judgmental eyes. I paced between bunks, unable to stop replaying the sight of Tessa's collapse, her voice layered with something not her own. I wondered how many citizens of Gathris had suffered the same fate, their minds hollowed out by the weight of their own devotion. In the early hours of the night cycle, the chanting intensified outside. It echoed through the vents like a rising tide, making the metal walls vibrate. I stepped outside the barracks and saw hundreds of civilians kneeling along the promenade, their faces angled toward the sky. Their bodies swayed in perfect synchronization, as if controlled by a single heartbeat. Flames glowed from braziers lining the walkway, casting a sickly yellow light that flickered across their contorted expressions. A high priest stood atop a podium, arms raised, his voice cutting through the drone. He shouted that the planet had spoken, that the faithful must prepare themselves for the trial to come. The crowd responded with screams of devotion that drowned out my own thoughts. I retreated inside and slammed the door shut, heart pounding. Rallick watched me with wide eyes, asking what was happening out there. I told him the truth, the only truth that mattered. Gathris was preparing for something, and whatever it was, the planet believed we were part of it. I checked Tessa again and found her breathing had grown shallower. Her veins darkened beneath her skin, spreading like the twisted symbol we had found carved into the shrine. I felt helpless, a sensation I despised. Soldiers were meant to fight enemies they could see, enemies with weapons and bodies, not planets that whispered through walls and corpses that died praying. Before I could process any of it, a loud chime rang through the barracks, signaling an emergency summons. The Vox speakers crackled to life, and a stern voice ordered all military units to report to the Grand Forum immediately. Rallick looked at me with silent dread. We both knew the summons was no routine inspection. I instructed him to guard Tessa while I attended the briefing. He protested, but I insisted, reminding him that she needed someone familiar nearby. He nodded reluctantly, gripping his rifle as if it were the only solid thing left in his world. When I arrived at the Grand Forum, the atmosphere felt electric with tension. Hundreds of soldiers stood in formation, their armor reflecting the flickering torchlight. Priests lined the upper balconies, chanting in perfect harmony. Their voices formed a layered wall of sound that made my bones ache. The commanding officer stepped onto the platform, his expression strained. He announced that the heretical agitation in the lower hives had worsened and that the entire regiment would begin immediate purges. His voice trembled slightly, betraying fear he tried to hide. He claimed the planet was under spiritual assault, though he refused to elaborate. The priests shouted in agreement, raising relics high, their enthusiasm unervingly intense. But then something happened that froze every soldier in place. The chanting stopped, not gradually, all at once. Thousands of voices went silent in the same instant, as if cut by a knife. The torches flickered, the air grew still. Then, from somewhere deep below the hive, a single voice rose. Not human, not mechanical, something else. A sound like a breath drawn through stone and metal and scripture. Every fanatic in the balconies fell to their knees. Every priest dropped their relics. Every soldier felt a pressure clamp around their ribs. And I understood, in that moment, a truth more terrifying than anything we had witnessed so far. Gathris was not preparing for a trial. It was responding to a command, and whatever gave that command had finally awakened. The silence that followed the awakening felt heavier than the chanting ever had. It pressed against my helmet, slid beneath the seals of my armor, and settled against my ribs like a cold hand testing for breath. I had heard battlefield silences before, the kind born from shock or fear or the aftermath of explosions, but this was something far older, something deliberate. It was the silence of a world listening. Every soldier in the Grand Forum stood frozen, rifles lowered, unable to determine whether raising a weapon would be considered obedience or blasphemy. The priests remained kneeling, their foreheads pressed to stone slick with incense oil. They trembled as if awaiting judgment, though nothing in the forum moved. The air tasted of dust and metal and a deeper wrongness that had no name in the Imperial lexicon. The voice rose again, deeper this time, resonating through the floors and walls like a vibration more felt than heard. My teeth ached as the sound passed through me. It was not speech in any language I knew, but it carried intent, a message etched into tone rather than words. Soldiers clutched their helmets, some dropping to one knee, others gasping for air. A few tried to steady themselves by reciting prayers, but the familiar words dissolved on their tongues, swallowed by the vibration before they could form properly. My heart hammered inside my chest, beating out of rhythm as though something external tried to pull it into sync with the deeper sound. I clenched my fist until the metal joints creaked, using pain as an anchor. When the sound finally faded, the commanding officer staggered forward, sweat dripping down his brow. He tried to reassure us, voice cracking, insisting that the disturbance was a localized psychic anomaly. The priests hissed at the word anomaly as if it insulted their faith. One priest, robed in crimson threads soaked with old blood, rose to his feet and declared that the planet had been blessed with revelation. His voice carried a manic fervor that made my stomach twist. He claimed the Emperor had whispered through the stone, testing the devotion of the faithful. The soldiers shifted uneasily, exchanging glances that betrayed their doubt. We all knew the difference between sacred visions and something else wearing holiness like a mask. The priest continued his proclamation, arms raised, chanting the twisted symbol we had seen carved into the shrine below. I felt a chill crawl along my spine. His chant matched the faint pattern etched into Tessa's veins. The officer tried to silence him, but the priest ignored the order, staring upward with eyes that glowed faintly from reflected torchlight. Other priests joined him, their voices layering in discordant harmony. The crowd of civilians who had gathered began to sway, their bodies moving with unnatural synchronicity. I felt the forum shifting toward something dangerous, a kind of unity born from madness rather than faith. Before any command could restore order, a tremor shook the ground beneath us. Dust fell from the ceiling. The torches flickered again. The lower hive levels throbbed with light as if the manufactorum itself pulsed with a heartbeat. A roar echoed upward, distant but unmistakable. Not a bestial roar, a mechanical one, something massive stirring within the bowels of the planet. The priest screamed praises. Soldiers raised their rifles, and I realized with sudden clarity that the voice had not awakened alone. Something else had been waiting with it. I left the forum as soon as the crowd descended into chaos, pushing my way through the mass of kneeling civilians and frenzied clergy. The lifts were clogged with bodies chanting in ecstasy, so I took the maintenance stairwell instead, descending through levels thick with incense smoke and the smell of overheated machinery. Each step pounded against the metal stairs, echoing through the narrow shaft like the ticking of a countdown. I focused on breathing evenly, on ignoring the flicker of shadows crawling along the walls. When I reached the barracks level, the door slammed open so hard it dented the frame. Rollick met me at the entrance, his face pale, his posture rigid. He said Tessa had awakened. I hurried inside, helm scraping the low doorway. Tessa sat upright on her bunk, hands resting on her knees, posture too perfect to be natural. Her eyes were open, staring straight ahead, but they did not see us. Her irises had darkened, the blackness bleeding outward like ink spreading across parchment. Her lips moved silently, forming shapes with religious precision, though no sound came out. Rollick stood beside her, rifle lowered but ready. His voice shook as he said she had not responded to anything he said or did. I approached her slowly, mindful not to startle her, though I doubted she could be startled anymore. Her skin had grown cold, and the veins beneath it pulsed faintly in patterns that mirrored the twisted carving from the shrine. She turned her head toward me in a single smooth motion, her gaze locking onto mine with chilling intensity. For a moment, I felt as though she were looking not at me but through me, examining something inside my thoughts. My hands tightened on my rifle, though I hated myself for the instinct. She was my soldier, my responsibility, but whatever stared through her eyes now was not Tessa. Suddenly she spoke. Her voice, a hollow echo, overlapped with the deeper tone we had heard in the hive depths. She whispered that the planet had been waiting for us. Not just soldiers, witnesses, instruments. She said Gathris was tired of worship that fed nothing. It hungered for unity, for obedience beyond doctrine. It wanted every voice aligned in perfect, unbroken devotion. My stomach churned as her words sank in. The planet did not just want prayers. It wanted control. Total, absolute, unrelenting control. Rollick stepped back, shaking his head in denial. He refused to believe she was still speaking. He said her lips were not moving, and when I looked again, he was right. Her voice still echoed through the room, but her mouth was still. The sound vibrated through the walls and floor, using her as a conduit. I lifted her chin gently, hoping to break whatever influence held her. But her eyes glazed over and rolled upward as if tracking something above us. The chanting outside intensified, rising in pitch until it became a piercing wail. Civilians rushed through the corridor, some screaming, others laughing with manic joy. Then the barracks lights went out. The blackout lasted only a moment, but in that moment I felt something brush my shoulder. Something cold, something deliberate. When the lights returned, the scripture etched into the walls glowed faintly, reacting to the new resonance pulsing through the hive. The symbols warped before our eyes, the lines bending and shifting into new patterns. Rollick cursed and stumbled back, nearly tripping over a footlocker. The glow intensified, bathing the room in a sickly green haze that made my vision blur. Tessa rose from the bed without using her hands, her movements fluid and slow. She stepped toward the door, ignoring both of us, her gaze locked on something only she could see. I reached out to stop her, but the moment my hand brushed her armor, the entire room shuddered. A shockwave rippled outward, knocking Rollick against the wall and sending me to one knee. The glowing scripture dimmed suddenly, extinguished as if smothered by unseen hands. Tessa paused in the doorway, her head turned toward me, and in a voice no human throat should have produced, she spoke a single sentence. "The planet is calling, and you will answer." Then she walked into the corridor. Rollick scrambled to his feet, shouting after her. I grabbed my rifle and followed, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The corridor was filled with frantic civilians, chanting soldiers, and priests screaming proclamations of awakening. The hive trembled with each distant roar from below, shaking dust loose from the ceiling. Tessa vanished into the crowd, swallowed by bodies moving in feverish devotion. As we pushed forward, rifles raised, smoke rising from broken vents, and prayers echoing like a storm, I understood something I had refused to admit. We were not here to stop fanaticism. We were here to witness its evolution. And whatever Gathris was becoming, it wanted us to become part of it. The corridor outside the barracks had transformed into something unrecognizable. The air burned with incense thick enough to sting my eyes even behind the visor. Civilians surged in chaotic waves, their movements neither panicked nor orderly, but something in between. A frenzy guided by purpose they did not understand. Their eyes were wide, pupils dilated, mouths twitching with silent devotion. Some pressed their palms against the walls as they passed, leaving smears of blood or oil as if feeding the structure itself. Others tore at the scripture-carved panels, revealing the metal beneath and whispering to it like lovers greeting a long-awaited reunion. Rollick and I pushed through them, shouting for them to clear a path, but they didn't hear us, or perhaps they simply didn't care. The deeper vibration that had haunted us since the manufactorum now pulsed through the hive like a heartbeat growing stronger with every cycle. The ground shook intermittently, tremors rippling through the floor plates with a rhythm too deliberate to be mechanical malfunction. This was no localized disturbance. The entire planet was moving in response to something. I clutched my rifle tighter and tried to steady my breath, but every inhale tasted of burnt metal and fevered faith. Tessa had vanished deeper into the hive's arterial corridors, carried by the tide of fanatics who moved as one organism. I led the way, tracking her through the Vox interference by the faint distortion she left behind. Her presence had become a beacon, a psychic hum that scraped against my skull. Rollick followed close behind, muttering prayers under his breath, each word fractured by panic. He had always been steady in battle, reliable in gunfire and chaos, but this was different. This was not war. This was a planet's mind pressing against our own. As we descended levels, the environment degraded further. Lights flickered in frantic pulses. Pipes groaned as if struggling to contain something swelling inside them. The devotional symbols etched into the walls twisted slowly, the carvings bending in patterns that defied the metal's rigidity. We reached a junction where 3 corridors converged, and all were choked with bodies. Civilians knelt in rows, foreheads slammed repeatedly into the floor, leaving trails of smeared blood. Soldiers stood among them, some weeping openly, others chanting with cracked voices. A young officer approached us, face pale, eyes shaking. He said the lower manufactorum levels had erupted in riots, though he hesitated to call them riots because the participants were not fighting among themselves. They were moving with coordinated intent, forming lines, lifting broken machinery as if building something. Something large. Something that required silence between breaths. I pushed past him, refusing to waste another second on explanations that offered no comfort. Rollick asked what I thought they were building. I told him I didn't know, but the truth was far worse. I feared I did. The distorted effigy in the chamber had been a prototype, a crude imitation. Whatever they were assembling now would be its perfected form. The shrine had been an echo. This would be the voice. We followed the psychic pull deeper until the walls changed texture. The metallic panels gave way to layers of waxy residue, as if candles had melted over centuries and reformed into glistening sheets. My stomach twisted when I realized the substance was not wax. It had patterns too organic, too fleshy. Rollick gagged but kept moving. The chanting grew louder, no longer confined to voices but resonating through the very material of the hive. Torches lined the walls now, though no one had lit them recently. Their flames burned with sickly yellow light that seemed immune to the drafts of the ventilation system. Shadows danced along the walls, moving independently of the torchlight. When we reached the heart of the manufactorum, the scale of the corruption became undeniable. The great assembly hall, once a place of industry, had transformed into a cathedral of machinery and flesh. Hundreds of figures encircled a towering construct rising from the floor. It was a fusion of broken engines, rusted chains, and body parts arranged with ritualistic precision. I recognized fragments of the twisted symbol etched into its growing structure. This was what the planet demanded, a physical manifestation of its call. Tessa stood at the base of the construct, her arms raised, directing the movements of the fanatics as though conducting an orchestra. Her voice had merged fully with the deeper tone, guiding them with perfect synchronization. I stepped forward, rifle aimed, though I had no idea what I intended to do. Kill her? Break the construct? Stop the ritual? None of it made sense. None of it mattered. The planet's will had already taken root. Tessa turned toward me, her eyes devoid of recognition, and spoke with that layered voice. She said Gathris had always been alive. Its faith had fermented for millennia. Its people had fed it with prayer, pain, sacrifice, and fear. And now, with enough devotion accumulated, the planet finally had the strength to express itself, to reshape its worshippers into extensions of its will. Rollick snapped, shouting at her to stop. He fired at the construct, but the bullets ricocheted off with unnatural force. The fanatics surged toward us, their movements jerky yet coordinated. Their skin darkened in patterns identical to Tessa's veins. I fired warning shots, trying to disperse them, but they kept coming, chanting louder with every step. Their voices melded into one rising cry, a single note of frenzied worship that made my vision blur. The air shimmered around the construct as it grew, metal bending, bodies merging into its frame. A sudden tremor rocked the chamber, knocking several fanatics off their feet. Rollick stumbled backward, landing hard against a pile of scrap metal. I caught myself against a railing, my rifle clattering against my chest. Above us, the ceiling bulged inward, as though something massive pushed from the other side. Cracks spiderwebbed across the stone, dust raining down in thick clouds. A deep roar reverberated through the hive, louder than before, louder than anything I'd heard in my years of service. Felt alive, hungry. The construct pulsed with energy, its components vibrating in unison with the roar. Tessa lifted her hands, and the crowd responded by bowing low, pressing their foreheads to the ground. I could feel the change happening. The planet was awakening physically, no longer content to whisper through stone. It wanted to reshape its surface, its people, its nature. Rollick crawled toward me, shouting my name through the deafening noise. He pointed upward in horror. I followed his gaze and saw the ceiling begin to tear open, molten rock glowing through the widening fractures. In that moment, I realized the planet was not simply speaking. It was emerging. The floor buckled beneath us as the awakening surged through the manufactorum. The chanting reached its peak, a chorus of ecstasy and terror blending into one. I dragged Rollick to his feet as the chamber collapsed around us. Tessa turned her gaze upward, arms outstretched as though greeting a long-lost deity. Her voice rose, the deeper tones swelling with triumph. We ran. We had no plan, no path, no hope. Only one thought remained clear inside my skull. Gathris had stopped pretending to be fanatical. It was now becoming the thing it had always worshipped, and we were trapped inside its birth throes. The manufactorum collapsed behind us in a cascade of shrieking metal and roaring stone. Rollick and I sprinted through the trembling corridor, each step jarring through my armor as the hive shuddered itself apart. The floor buckled, vents burst open, and incandescent gas blasted across our path. Behind us, the chanting did not falter. Even as structures crumbled and bodies were crushed beneath falling debris, the voices of Gathris's devotees rose in unwavering harmony. Their devotion was no longer worship. It was fuel. A pipe ruptured above us, spraying scalding steam. I shoved Rollick forward, taking the brunt of the heat against my shoulder plate. The metal hissed and warped, burning through the paint. Pain radiated through the impact gel beneath, but I forced myself onward. We reached a stairwell only to find the upper section twisted into a spiral of warped steel, as though something had grabbed it and wrung it like cloth. Melted scripture dripped down the walls, the carved lines liquefying into symbols that slid downward like insects fleeing the heat. Rollick pointed to an access tunnel branching off to the side. The warning lights above it flickered in a frantic stutter, casting the corridor in alternating pulses of red and darkness. We stumbled into it just as a section of the ceiling behind us ripped open, revealing a chasm filled with glowing stone. The roar that spilled from below was no longer faint or distant. It was thunderous, consuming, a single, terrible sound rising through the planet's veins like blood boiling under pressure. Gathris was not merely awakening, it was transforming. We forced ourselves deeper into the tunnel, our boots splashing through pools of oil and blood. The temperature fluctuated wildly, the air cycling from freezing to blistering with each tremor. At the far end of the passage, the metal wall had buckled outward, as if pushed by an explosion from within. We climbed through the jagged breach and emerged onto an exterior balcony overlooking the upper hive. The sight froze me in place. The city was tearing itself open. Hive spires bent like softened wax, groaning as their foundations twisted. Towers adorned with ancient relics cracked down the middle, spilling rivers of ash and debris into the streets below. Great plumes of fire erupted from the manufactorum chimneys, shaped into unnatural spirals. The sky pulsed with sickly yellow light as lightning arced between the hive's highest points. Civilians filled the walkways, kneeling or swaying, their bodies contorted in devotion. Their eyes glowed faintly, mirroring the molten fissures ripping across the planet's surface. I had seen exterminatus worlds before, planets consumed by fire or virus or orbital bombardment. But I had never seen a world destroy itself from within, not as an act of terror or rebellion, but as an act of worship. "We need to get to the extraction platform," Rollick shouted over the growing roar. I scanned the horizon and saw the distant silhouette of the military landing spires. They tilted slightly, but they were still intact for now. I nodded and pulled Rollick away from the balcony as another tremor rippled through the hive, sending chunks of stone crashing onto the walkway behind us. We raced through streets filled with chaos, priests swinging censers that spat sparks, soldiers firing into crowds out of fear, civilians prostrating themselves on pathways that crumbled beneath their knees. All the while, the deeper tone vibrated through the air, rising in frequency until my vision blurred. Halfway to the spire, a group of frenzied worshippers blocked our path. Their bodies trembled violently, veins pulsing with darkened patterns. They chanted in perfect unison, voices merging into a single layered sound. Their eyes rolled upward as they raised their arms toward us, not in threat, but in reverence. "It chooses," one whispered. "It calls," another added. "It hungers," a third finished. Their bodies convulsed suddenly, collapsing into spasms. Rollick froze, horrified, but I forced him past them. As we ran, I couldn't shake the realization that they weren't warning us. They were welcoming us. We reached the base of the landing spire as a massive tremor split the street behind us. A fissure opened, glowing molten red, swallowing dozens of kneeling civilians who did not scream as they fell. They simply continued chanting until the molten heat melted their voices into silence. I dragged Rollick up the spire's staircase, each step vibrating beneath our feet. The landing platform above glowed with emergency lights, and for a fleeting moment, hope sparked in my chest. Several dropships remained. Their engines whined anxiously as pilots prepared for evacuation. Then the deeper tones surged again. Every civilian and priest on the spire fell to their knees in the same instant. Several soldiers dropped their rifles, clutching their helmets as if something clawed at their minds. The dropships flickered as their power cores stuttered, interference rippling through their systems. A pulse of yellow light arced across the sky, striking one ship and causing it to explode in a burst of molten debris. The blast wave slammed into us, knocking Rollick off his feet. I pulled him up by his armor collar, shouting for him to move, but he only stared past me, eyes wide. Tessa stood at the far end of the landing platform. She was unhelmeted, her face pale but serene, her veins glowing faintly. Her armor had been stripped of insignia, replaced with scraps of scripture stitched into its plates. She walked toward us with slow, deliberate steps. Every person on the platform turned their gaze to her, even those writhing on the ground. She raised one hand, and the deeper tone intensified, rattling every bolt in the spire. Rollick stepped forward, tears streaking his face. He begged her to stop, begged her to come back, begged her to remember who she had been. Tessa tilted her head, studying him with the detached curiosity of a creature observing something unfamiliar. When she spoke, her voice was layered and resonant. "You are witnessing birth," she said. "Do not cling to the old world." Rollick shook his head violently and reached for her, but she flicked her hand. A wave of force slammed into him, sending him crashing into a support pillar. His armor dented with a sickening crunch. I shouted his name and ran to him, but he lay motionless, blood trickling from beneath his helmet. Rage surged through me, raw and unfiltered. I raised my rifle at Tessa, hands trembling. She didn't flinch. "You are chosen," she whispered. "It has spoken to you more clearly than the others." I fired. The bolt cracked through the air, striking her squarely in the chest. She staggered, but did not fall. Her flesh rippled around the impact, the veins glowing brighter for a moment. She touched the wound, studying it with a faint smile. "Resistance is devotion," she said softly, and I honor it. The spire trembled violently. The sky tore open with a scream of molten stone as a colossal fissure ripped across the horizon. The deeper tone became a roar so powerful it shook the metal plates beneath us. Dropships launched in panic, engines sputtering under the psychic pressure. I pulled Rollick's body toward one still functioning, my muscles screaming under the weight. Tessa raised both arms. The world obeyed. The spire cracked. The ground split beneath us. The sky glowed like a furnace. I threw Rollick into the dropship and dove inside as the hatch sealed behind me. The pilot screamed that the engines couldn't stabilize, but I ordered him to launch anyway. We rose shakily, the spire collapsing into the glowing fissure below. Through the viewport, I saw Tessa standing amidst the destruction, her silhouette framed by molten light. She raised her gaze to the sky. The planet roared back. The dropship lurched upward, breaking through the clouds as Gathris continued to convulse. Fires erupted across the surface. Hive spires toppled. The crust split open like a hatching shell. And somewhere deep below, something awakened fully. As we broke orbit, I watched the world writhe in birth, its fanatical devotion finally manifesting as physical transformation. Rollick lay dying beside me. I gripped his hand through our gauntlets as the planet shrank behind us. He whispered one question before the light faded from his eyes. "Sergeant, what was it really?" I did not know how to answer, because as Gathris tore itself apart in worship of its own awakening, I understood the truth that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Some worlds do not fall to heresy. Some worlds do not rebel. Some worlds do not corrupt. Some worlds simply decide to stop pretending to be planets. Gathris was never fanatical. It was alive, and we were only ever inside its throat.